So in my last video, I covered a film by the name of Teen Star Academy, and I think reviewing that film actually took a toll on my health. While working on that video, I was sleeping poorly, I was in a terrible mood, my trichotillomania started acting up again, I had an IBS flare-up. I think that movie may have genuinely put a curse on me. So coming off of that, I decided that I had to work on something at least a little more intellectually engaging for my next video. Which led me to The Goldfinch, the 2019 film based on the Donna Tartt novel of the same name. I've wanted to talk about this film really ever since I first saw it last year. I saw John Crowley's The Goldfinch at an advanced screening, and because it was an advanced screening, I just kind of assumed that reviews weren't out yet, so I didn't look them up. And after seeing the film, I thought, okay, this must have at least a 70% on Rotten Tomatoes or something. So imagine my surprise when I looked it up and found out it had a dismal 24%. I was shocked. It wasn't great, but knowing the current state of what mainstream critics and award shows tend to favor in Hollywood, I was sure that this would garner pretty good reviews. Alas, this was not the case. Not only did the film flop, like belly flop spectacularly, but critical reception was scathing. Shows the perils of being too faithful to the book, Donna Tartt's art theft epic has its wings clipped, just a series of unfortunate events, the plot thickens to sludge, a soulless movie makeover. Amidst all this mess surrounding the release, star of the film Ansel Elgort gave this pitifully sad interview defending the film by saying that his mom liked it, which I can only describe as gut-wrenchingly embarrassing. Last September, I went to see the film for a second time in theaters, and I was buying my ticket a half hour in advance on the app, and every single seat was available. Nobody had bought a ticket yet. But anyways, despite all this, I did enjoy the film somewhat. Again, I don't think it's amazing, but I think it was really as well executed as it could have been, given the nature of the source material. I hadn't read the book before seeing the movie, but I did read it for this video. Having now read the book, I feel ready to defend this mediocre film. I'd like to first point out the problems with the novel, then go into what works and doesn't work in the film. I'm here to tell you that The Goldfinch isn't that bad, you guys are just mean. Except the book is kind of bad, and people haven't been mean enough. Spoilers for all of this, I guess. Most of the problems with the film ultimately stem from the book. If you haven't read the book or seen the film, The Goldfinch follows Theodore Decker, who, as a young boy, loses his mother in an explosion at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the confusion of the accident, Theo ends up making off with the Dutch painting The Goldfinch by Fabritius. As he moves from the care of his wealthy friend's family to his alcoholic, gambling father's home in Las Vegas, and ultimately back to New York to live and work with a benevolent antique restorer, his anxiety surrounding his secret grows. Furthermore, a reunion with Boris, an old friend from Las Vegas, shatters his relationship with the painting as he knows it. Now that may sound like a lot of plot, and it is. I have to give the filmmakers credit for, at the very least, doing what they could to adapt what is very nearly an unadaptable novel. Let's talk about that novel. When Donna Tartt's book released, it was immediately popular, the entire literary community was talking about it, it won numerous accolades, including a Pulitzer. It was a big deal. But reception at the time was, and remains to this day, actually quite polarized. While many mainstream critics hailed the novel as a sprawling Dickensian epic that engaged the mind and touched the heart or something, plenty of critics were also scratching their heads at what they perceived to be a meandering, pretentious, thematically muddled mess. Interestingly, many of the negative reviews were coming from the most elite, highbrow literary critics in America, writers for The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and the Paris Review. Evgenia Peretz, in her Vanity Fair article, "It's Tart, but is it art?", frames the negative reception as being largely a sort of class battle within literary circles, the bitter, snobbish upper crust of the book world attacking poor Donna's novel for daring to top the New York Times bestseller list, letting the book's mass appeal influence their reviews more than the content of the work itself. And I don't really agree with either party's perspective here. On the one hand, I do find some of these reviews pretty ridiculous. James Woods of The New Yorker and Christopher Taylor of the London Review criticize The Goldfinch for being a children's novel, which I think is a little unfair. It's one thing to acknowledge the clearly intentional Dickensian influence and references, but some of these reviews claim that the language or literal content of the novel is better suited to children than adult readers, which I think is blatantly untrue. If there's one thing you can't say about The Goldfinch, you cannot say that it's not verbose. But on the other hand, I think it's unfair to act as if most, if not all, of the negative reactions to the book come from a place of literary elitism, thinking that it's not good enough or adult enough for the accolades it received. I liked Francine Prose's review quite a bit. I mean, first of all, what a terrifically apt name for a literary critic. Prose focuses mainly on the actual technical writing in the book, pointing out several examples of sloppy descriptions, metaphors, and similes that, under just a little bit of scrutiny, don't make no sense. Was I the only reader who, a few pages into the novel, was stopped cold by a sentence describing how people react to Theo's half-Irish, half-Cherokee mother? In the slant of her cheekbones, there was such an eccentric mixture of the tribal and the Celtic twilight that sometimes people guessed she was Icelandic. Could I really have been the only one thinking, sometimes? Just how many people guessed she was Icelandic? Though the Vanity Fair article I mentioned makes out Prose's criticism to be, again, this snobby, pedantic lamentation of the death of technique in literature, they just don't write 'em like they used to, I think that her quotes were taken somewhat out of context. Prose illustrates her thesis by referencing Fabritius's Goldfinch painting, comparing literature to visual art. Essentially, she writes, what moves us about visual art is not so much the actual image a piece represents, but rather the skill and artfulness with which it was created. Similarly, in written fiction, the story itself can often only take us so far. True enjoyment of a piece of writing relies on the way it was written. I agree with this conclusion. Frankly, when I reached the end of The Goldfinch, I was more frustrated than anything else. There had been numerous elements and characters that I'd enjoyed, but the story had neither the thematic coherence nor the clear, consistent writing that would have made it a satisfying and worthwhile read in my eyes. I had already read Tartt's first novel, The Secret History, and while both novels share a similarly dense, rich prose, The Secret History, especially when compared to The Goldfinch, is so much more concise and coherent and thematically tight. The ending of The Goldfinch is, for me, the most infuriatingly baffling part of the novel. Once the various conflicts have been hastily and anticlimactically resolved, our narrator, Theo, spends a hefty 12 pages giving us a muddled, nearly incoherent, here's what I learned monologue. There's this Vox article by Constance Grady on why the film adaptation failed that I think sums it up pretty well. This idea is trotted out so clumsily in Theo's endless-seeming final monologue that it's hard to feel like it's interesting enough to withstand the weight of this entire book. I feel I have something very serious and urgent to say to you, my non-existent reader, and I feel I should say it as urgently as if I were standing in the room with you, Theo says in his final paragraph before delivering this weighty message. That life, whatever else it is short. Oh, okay. I just read 771 pages for that. The book has a few primary themes. The value of objects. While life is fleeting, certain significant physical objects, things like antiques, works of art, are in a way immortal. That good can come from bad and vice versa. Nothing is black and white. It's kind of like that one episode of 13 Reasons Why.
The good person is indistinguishable from the bad.
Who did it better? Trauma, I would say, how childhood trauma can affect people as adults. Drug use, addiction, the ways in which addictions can form, especially in young people. I'm sure there are more themes that one could dissect, but these are the main ones that I noticed. There is also, as Grady points out in her article, some troubling class commentary in this novel. Theo and the novel itself make a lot of moral judgments about various characters based on class and taste. Essentially, in the novel's moral logic, extremely rich people are bad, but not because they're greedy or exploitative or out of touch. No, they're bad because they don't have good enough taste in antiques. That's putting it a little simply, but for example, in Theo's assessment of the Barbers, a very wealthy family of New York socialites, he judges Mr. Barber for his love of kitschy Americana, judges the daughter Kitsy for wanting to buy brand new Tiffany wedding china instead of beautiful old antique china with character. Meanwhile, the novel wastes no time establishing that Theo's father and his father's girlfriend Xandra are the poorest, tackiest, and therefore the least morally sound characters. I mean, Theo's dad is a former TV actor and gambles and drinks beer and lives in cheap Las Vegas housing, and Xandra works at a bar and wears lip gloss and juicy couture. The horror! Tartt decides to place the purest moral goodness in characters like Theo's mother and his benefactor, Hobie. These are characters who have studied art history, have good taste, are deeply intellectual, care about beauty. And yet, these characters are far from rich, okay? Theo's mom had to work as a model to put herself through college, and yeah, she and Theo live in a rent-controlled apartment with doormen in Manhattan, but they had to go to matinees instead of evening shows when Theo's dad left, okay? Yeah, Theo's mom had an education fund set aside for him with like over $60,000 in it, but they had to buy the cheap Chinese food, okay? Hobie is similarly poor but not poor. He apparently has enough money to keep his beautiful house and shop in the village, fund all of his antique restoration, keep a huge storage unit that apparently costs thousands of dollars a month, but supposedly he's deep in debt? So it's fine. But he's only in debt because, as Theo puts it, he refuses to do the one thing he could easily do to make money. It's a very bohemian ideal, like poor by choice, starving artist by choice, because that's nobler than holding a regular job. I doubt Donna Tartt intended to send this exact message, that poor, uneducated people are morally inferior to wealthier intellectuals, but it sure comes off that way. And when discussing theme in The Goldfinch, we have to acknowledge the general thematic messiness. While all of the aforementioned themes have their place in the story, I wouldn't say any of them really carry through consistently enough to give this story a point. And that is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, for me at least, when I'm reading or watching a piece of fiction with a story. What does it mean? What is the creator trying to say? After reading The Goldfinch, I'm not sure what Tartt was trying to say. I think the tacked-on feeling final monologue attempts to hastily remedy the lack of coherent message, but I don't think it succeeds. All this to say that, unfortunately, the problems with the novel carry over into the film. But while there are a lot of issues, I do believe that the filmmakers made a valiant effort to solve some of these problems. So now that we've discussed the problems with the book, let's examine the good and bad in the film. The nonlinear timeline. Yeah, I said it, I actually liked the nonlinear timeline. This isn't like a nonlinear timeline, like a Wong Kar-wai film or something. It's what I would call a Hollywood nonlinear timeline. Meaning, there are some sequences that are not in linear order, but the major events of the story still basically progress in a linear way. But still, I think this was a good decision on the filmmaker's part. In my opinion, the book doesn't have a terribly good sense of pacing. It's not boring, but I didn't really feel the momentum of the story. It felt like a lot of setup and not a whole lot of other stuff. So I think taking the events of the story and scrambling them a little bit lends more consistency of pacing, more of a sense of equilibrium. I've seen a couple stupid articles say that giving it a nonlinear timeline made the movie too confusing, and I think that's ridiculous. Honestly, when people complain that nonlinear timelines are too confusing, this is how I see them. I see them as little babies. Remember last year when that guy from the Motion Picture Academy said that he found the timeline of Little Women too confusing? Yeah, I see that man as a tiny adult baby. Aw, was the movie too complicated for baby to understand? Maybe you shouldn't be in the Motion Picture Academy then, bucko. My senior year analysis and criticism teacher had a saying about films like this, and that was, the film teaches you how to watch it. And that's the truth. If it's a well-made film, all you have to do is watch it, and it will help you understand how it works. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent. Anyways, the cinematography and filmmaking. Say what you want about this film, it looks beautiful. It has cinematography by Roger Deakins, one of the most celebrated cinematographers alive. He won his second Oscar recently for his work on 1917. Not for the Goldfinch, though. Deakins does consistently great work, and the Goldfinch is no exception. I think his work in this film is especially impressive given the fact that in a lot of ways it's a very conventionally shot film. What I mean by that is that there's not a whole lot of stylistic flair to the cinematography or really to the visuals at all. There aren't a lot of zany camera movements or editing choices, and yet Deakins proves his mastery of the craft by making it work. I think it's one thing to be able to shoot in an experimental, eccentric style and make that beautiful, but I think it takes a lot more restraint to shoot in a conventional style and still make that beautiful. Sometimes less is more, especially in a film like this where the settings and even set decorations often speak for themselves. The camera work in the Las Vegas portion of the film really stands out. It seems like they were able to do a lot with this setting. Even if you hate this movie, you could probably just turn the sound off and look at the pictures. You would probably enjoy that. Finn Wolfhard. Let's be real, he deserves his own point. Mind you, I was not a Finn Wolfhard fan before seeing The Goldfinch. I didn't dislike him, but I had never seen Stranger Things or the It movies. I probably never will. But this movie made me a Finn Wolfhard fan. I saw the turning for Finn Wolfhard. Yeah, if anything, Finn owes me for making me watch that movie. I'm starting a class action lawsuit against that movie. I feel entitled to compensation. Anyways, Finn Wolfhard as Boris may be the best part of The Goldfinch. As soon as he appears on screen, the mood just shifts, and you think, wow, maybe I am watching an entertaining movie.
My father digs mines. People hate us everywhere we go because the company promised they won't fuck up the environment. And they fuck up the environment.
He definitely gives the most energetic performance in the film as this campy, alcoholic, possibly gay, Slavic little boy drug addict, and it's amazing. That's it. Finn Wolfhard, you did a great job. I hope you got a fat check for this one. For that matter, both child leads. Oak Svegley as Theo is also very good in this. He's better than Ansel Elgort, that's for sure. His emotional moments are some of the most believable in the film. They're a lot more convincing than Ansel Elgort's. Child actors are often not amazing.
How would you like it if I took you to a shop and bought you a guitar of your very own?
Why, yes!
So it's very impressive how well these two actors hold their own in this film. Also, I have less to say about this, but I thought Jeffrey Wright was great as Hobie. I think he was perfectly cast. But despite all of the good in the film, there is, unfortunately, plenty of bad. The elephant in the room. Ansel Elgort. Let's get this out of the way. Ansel Elgort sucks. Not only are his acting abilities questionable at best, but as of this year, he is also an alleged sexual predator. Yes, in June of 2020, a Twitter user named Gabby accused Elgort of sexually assaulting her in 2014 when she and Elgort were in a relationship. Gabby was 17 at the time, Elgort was 20. They actually first started talking when Gabby was 16. And yes, he was aware of her age. In response to these allegations, Elgort did admit that he'd been in a relationship with Gabby, but he claimed that it was all consensual and that he'd essentially ghosted her after breaking up with her, so basically implying that she was making these claims like in retaliation for that. Obviously, we don't know for sure that these allegations are true, but I tend to err on the side of believing women, believing people who make the accusations. And given that Elgort admitted to being in the relationship, and given that Gabby was underage at the time, I find it pretty easy to believe that something bad may have happened. And even if there wasn't an allegation of assault, I am pretty turned off already just by the fact that Elgort would have dated someone that young when he was a full adult. Anywho, I am not going to give money to any of Elgort's projects in the future. I did not give him any money for this video. I obtained this movie in such a way that I did not have to pay for it. But even all of that stuff aside, Ansel Elgort is just not a good actor. For one thing, I think he fails to distinguish his roles from one another. Like, if you told me that this character was the same person as this character, I would believe you. There's nothing in his performance that makes me believe that Theo is any different from any of these guys. Also, I can't really explain why this is true, but any scene where he has to show a lot of emotion is just terrible. It's not convincing.
I don't believe one word you're saying.
And did you say?
Go girl, give us nothing. He feels like an empty shell of a person in this film, which in turn makes it seem like Theo has no personality. Grown-up Boris is miscast. Like I said, I really liked Finn Wolfhard's performance, but unfortunately I wasn't as crazy about older Boris, played by Aneurin Barnard. Sorry. This is kind of petty. I admit it, kind of a nitpick, but I feel that if you're going to cast a kid as weird looking, as distinctive looking as Finn Wolfhard, you have to be careful about who you cast to play the older version of him. I think Bill Hader works well enough in It because he's also kind of weird looking, but he also has the strong bone structure and whatever. I'm not saying you have to find a doppelganger or anything, but Barnard is just really not convincing for me. Here's a concrete thing that I can say. Finn Wolfhard is currently 2 inches taller than Aneurin Barnard. And obviously he's a very young guy, so it's totally possible that at the time of filming he hadn't grown those 2 inches. But oh wait, look at this picture from the premiere where Finn is visibly taller than Aneurin. Again, maybe at the time of filming he was a little shorter, but this is so funny to me. When I first saw the film, my first thought was, oh my god, why didn't they cast Ezra Miller for this part? He would have been perfect, right? He has all the right features to play older Finn Wolfhard much more convincingly. So this was my idea for months and months after I saw the film. And then, a little while into quarantine, a video starts making the rounds on Twitter of a drunk Ezra Miller choking one of his female fans. So never mind, I guess. Why do these white boy actors with big lips keep disappointing us like this? Currently, Nick Robinson is the only actor of the white boys with big lips generation who I feel I can trust. So Nick, you're on thin ice, you better not do anything. Anyways, I just wish they had cast an actor who resembled Finn Wolfhard a little more. It took me out of the movie at times. Clunky dialogue. I think this is also likely a remnant from the book. Sometimes things that sound okay in writing just don't sound as natural out loud in a movie. I will just play you some examples of lines that sounded weird, and this will be the end of the section.
Who do I have to blow to get a cup of coffee around this place?
You're an awfully good guest.
It had to live its whole life like that? Trapped?
I wear bespoke suits.
Hello, lovely.
I can recommend the Poulard.
That's fine, thank you.
The styling. Styling in film is something I've been paying a lot more attention to in recent years. In fact, bad styling has become one of the things that bothers me the most in a film. It can take you out of the experience in a very immediate visual way. If you're aiming for realism and your character's clothing, hair, and makeup don't look lived in and believable, you're in trouble. You want people, not mannequins from the Gap. I did not like most of the styling in the Goldfinch. I'm not a big fan of the styling of the older versions of Theo and Boris. Theo is alright, I like his sweater looks, and I guess his bespoke suits
I wear bespoke suits.
are accurate to the novel, but he just looks a little too perfect to me. I know that part of his character is putting on this facade for people, but even so, it bothers me when films refuse to lend any realistic dishevelment to their characters. Older Boris's styling, I'm really not into. In my view of the character, Boris is a cool guy, especially in adulthood. In the book, Theo acknowledges that he's handsome, and I would guess that he probably still has his punky goth thing going on from his youth, just with more money and more maturity. He should look awesome, so tell me why they put him in these ugly, ill-fitting, out-of-style clothes. What is this too small leather jacket, these plain button-up shirts? I'm sorry, what is this jeans to belt equation? What is this ugly fur collar coat? Why did they have to do him like this? Somebody in the costume department hated adult Boris. That's my conspiracy theory. I also found Mrs. Barber's styling distracting. This is another result of that type of styling that looks too perfect. It's one thing to make a character look well-maintained and conscious of their appearance, it's another to make them look styled. Mrs. Barber looks like a character in a movie, not a real person. The way every single hair is in place, even later in life when she's supposed to be a decrepit old widow who won't get out of bed. There's a reason Miss Havisham usually looks like this, and not like this. There are some good things. I think the styling of the younger versions of Theo and Boris are much better. It's not only more accurate and in character, but also feels much more lived in. I also love how much luscious cabled knitwear there is in this movie. It's hard to go wrong there. But overall, a lot of it is distracting. The still messy themes. Again, I commend the filmmakers for even trying to take on this beautiful mess of a novel. They definitely tried to make it make sense thematically. But they could only do so much. The end of the film condenses the scene in which Boris clumsily adds a theme to the story. In the book, Boris comes up to Theo's hotel room and spends, no joke, 20 pages explaining what happened to the painting and describing what that means thematically, with zero subtlety. In the film, Boris saves Theo from his suicide attempt and takes him to a restaurant to give a much shorter version of this speech. I do think having Boris interrupt Theo's suicide attempt was a good decision. It makes it more connected to the plot, it has higher stakes. In the book, Theo just does that alone and survives, and the book keeps going, but the Boris speech continues to not work in the film. If anything, shrinking down this explanation makes the theme even more problematic. The point of it is basically, sometimes good can come from bad and vice versa, and nothing is truly black and white.
So we have done bad things. But maybe sometimes good can come from bad.
And yeah, that's sort of true sometimes, but is the best illustration of this theme, murder is okay as long as it results in lost art being found? If you haven't read the book or seen the film, you might think I'm being hyperbolic, but literally the argument in this scene is, yeah, Theo killed a guy, shot him dead, but that guy was a bad guy who had stolen lots of fine art, and when we called the police on his people, they found a bunch of other stolen art in addition to the Goldfinch, so sometimes good comes from bad. So, murder good. Thanks, Donna. The film actually adds a little moment to the very end in attempt to tie it all together, and I appreciate this. It's much better than the book's ending. The film cuts between footage of young Theo walking through the museum with his mother prior to her death, and footage of older Theo walking with Mrs. Barber through her house. At the very end, we hear Theo's mom say that this is her favorite painting, as we see Theo and Mrs. Barber looking at themselves in a mirror. I am okay with this. It's clearly showing that Theo is at peace with his found family and sort of implies that his mother is looking out for him or at least would approve of his life now. It ties things together and is emotional, which is more than you can say of the ending of the novel. But it still doesn't really have much to do with the rest of the story, like this sentiment doesn't work as the entire point of the film. Again, the filmmakers made a valiant effort, but the story is still quite muddled thematically. Okay, let's discuss some miscellaneous stupid. The way Nicole Kidman plays Mrs. Barber in this film, she almost plays it like she's supposed to be evil. One of my notes was, make Nicole Kidman less evil seeming.
You're an awfully good guest.
Theo's house in Las Vegas looks just like the model home from Arrested Development. The film spends a lot less time developing this villain, Lucius Reeve, who, in the latter half of the story, starts blackmailing Theo over Theo's fraud, selling fake antiques, because he knows that Theo has a connection to the Goldfinch painting and he's trying to buy it from Theo. I guess I'm glad that the film didn't devote any more time to exposition to explain who Reeve is, but the result is that you don't understand what is motivating him to do this to Theo. It seems like he's just doing it for no reason because you don't have the background from the book, so that's a little confusing. And speaking of Lucius Reeve, in this scene he's meant to show Theo an article about the Goldfinch, and he hands him a printed out New York Times article. I thought this was a really stupid prop decision. Why would you not just make a fake newspaper with that article in it? It looks so stupid to show him having printed out an online article, in color no less. Who does that? There's this moment where Theo meets Boris. They're in English class, and they're talking about Thoreau's Walden, and there's this girl talking about how stupid it is.
I mean, if everybody just dropped out and moved around the woods, what kind of society would we have?
It's irresponsible.
Right. If it's just people like him, we wouldn't have stores, or television, or roads.
And the teacher clearly thinks she's stupid, and Theo and Boris clearly think she's stupid. Boris calls her a twat, which happens in the book and the film. And I'm just sitting there listening to this, and I'm like, she's not wrong. This is a perfectly acceptable response to Walden, especially when you consider that Thoreau's mommy did all his laundry for him. I know there's been some pushback to that type of criticism, like, well, other famous authors also didn't do their own laundry, and I would say the difference is that those other authors didn't center their entire philosophy around being independent from civilization. Hot take. Transcendentalism is for those white man libertarians who have never had any real problems and thus think that it should be every man for himself and think they owe nothing to their communities because they don't realize how much they rely on and benefit from the labor of others, namely women and people of color. Like, okay, sure, go live in the woods, but who's gonna do your laundry? Do you know how to cook? Who's going to make the clothes on your back that you bought from a department store that uses sweatshop labor in Bangladesh? You would not be alive without the contributions of others. What makes you exempt from repaying that debt to society? Anyways, I see media do this a lot. Try to paint a certain character, usually a woman, as stupid and vapid for voicing what the protagonist perceives to be a stupid and vapid opinion. But it often backfires on me and makes me like that character more than whatever character is making fun of her. Nice try, Donna, but I love dumb girl logic. One dumb girl possesses more wisdom in her pinky toe than 1,000 white man philosophers. Boris and Theo's relationship. Back when I had only seen the film and not read the book, I had heard that Boris and Theo's relationship was much more charged in the book, like romantically and or sexually. I mean, online, especially on places like Tumblr, Goldfinch content tends to be dominated by one particular thing. From what I was seeing, in my online circles at least, I was under the impression that the film had really whitewashed this relationship. And it really didn't. Here's the deal. There is a little more to it in the book, namely Theo basically explicitly acknowledging that their relationship was sexual as teens, and at one point saying that he loves Boris, in addition to Boris kissing Theo when they're parting as teens, which is included in the film. And I mean, that sounds like a lot, and yet it's confusingly not meaningful in the story. In the book, despite the homoerotic nature of their friendship in Las Vegas, when they meet up again as adults, that aspect is seemingly completely gone. Boris briefly acknowledges it, but immediately writes it off, saying, "I think it happens at that age sometimes. We were young and needed girls. I think maybe you thought it was something else," implying that he thinks that maybe it was more meaningful to Theo. And it would be one thing if Theo seemed repressed about this, if we got any indication from his adult self that this relationship actually was meaningful to him in that way, but we don't. Christopher Taylor says in his review that Tartt does a better job at making Theo convincingly bloke-ish, to the point where there's less of a question mark over his sexuality than with the protagonist of The Secret History, Richard Papin. In The Secret History, Richard also has some encounters with another male character, Francis. And I guess I agree that Theo seems more straight than Richard, but I don't agree with the framing that this is necessarily a good thing story-wise. If anything, it's more confusing and distracting to me to have that element of homoeroticism and then never really have it matter again. As the novel progresses, it begs the question, why even include that in the story at all if it's not going to mean anything or go anywhere? I'm mentioning this because I think it's confusing, both in the book and the film, though I think that the film handles it a little better by toning it down a bit and thus making it less distracting. I'm mostly just confused as to how so many people were able to draw the conclusion that Theo is gay and repressed or whatever, when I didn't get that from the text at all. And I was actively looking for it. I don't get this, Donna. I don't understand what you were trying to do. And that's a pretty good summary of my reaction to this book as a whole. I don't understand what you were trying to do. So what can we take away from all of this? As I mentioned before, I think that this novel is nearly unadaptable. I assume that when it came out, it was so popular that somebody immediately snatched up the film rights and said, "We have to make a movie of this, we'll make a fortune!" And I mean, if we really wanted to adapt the book faithfully, I think the only way to do it would probably be in miniseries form, just to have enough time for everything. But then again, why would we? This film is a great example of just because you can doesn't mean you should. Not every best-selling novel has to be a movie. Some of them are better suited to just sit on your bookshelf collecting dust and occasionally be shown off to your more snobbish house guests. But that being said, let's talk about the reception of the film. Again, I was shocked by how negative the reviews were. As I think we've made clear, it's not a great movie, but in execution alone, it's so much better than some of the garbage that comes out every year and gets good reviews. You really mean to tell me you think that Mary Poppins Returns, and Harriet, and Ma, and Bombshell, and Bohemian Rhapsody are better than The Goldfinch? Yeah, you would be wrong about that. I think that literary adaptations in particular tend to get a bad rap because people go in with expectations, and often these expectations differ from person to person depending on what the book meant to them. Like, I don't think that either film adaptation of The Great Gatsby is actually that bad, but that novel means so many different things to so many different people that I think it would be very difficult to make an adaptation that pleases everyone. It's a good reminder that film criticism is extremely subjective, and sometimes mainstream film critics are wrong. I have a theory, the Goldfinch theory, that if this film were the exact same film, the same script and everything, but not based on a book, just an original screenplay, or maybe based on the real life of a famous author or something, it would have gotten at least an 80% on Rotten Tomatoes and been nominated for at least 5 Oscars. Because nothing makes sense, and life is fake, and so are the movies. Anyways, to Donna Tartt, all I can say is, better luck next time? I genuinely am a fan of The Secret History, and this is a major long shot since I am a 20-year-old who's only attended like 2/3 of a year of film school, but it's kind of a dream of mine to adapt The Secret History to film. I think it's much more suited to film. So, Donna, if you're looking for someone to do it, I have attended a whole 2/3 of a year at film school. Hit me up. I know you're watching this video. Anyways, subscribe to my channel for more overly long reviews of media that isn't relevant anymore.